See, here's the thing, everybody. I wonder how many of us, even believers, realize that the most important work we're going to do in life is discerning God's call. It's not finding worldly success. I mean, that's fine as far as it goes. But that's not the most important work we're going to do. It's not getting into the best school. It's not getting the best job. I mean, those are fine. But the most important work we're going to do is the work of discerning our vocation. How the providential God is calling us to follow Him. That's what it's about. Well, veteran Hollywood actor Mark Wahlberg has come out with a new movie called Father Stu, and in many ways, I think it's the movie about the priesthood that the church and the wider world really needs. It's also one of the most theologically interesting movies of the last many years. All sorts of themes emerge. The nature of suffering, providence, vocation, prayer, the nature of the priesthood itself, all that really is under consideration. And I'd like to just look in the course of this commentary at two themes I think that were really important, namely providence and vocation. You know, I've said this before, but I think a lot of religious believers today in our culture basically accept a deist view of God, by which I mean, it's the view prominent in the 18th century, that God exists, but God's a distant supreme being, a distant first cause that got the universe going, but then basically retired and is not involved in the affairs of the world, not involved personally and directly in human affairs. Well, that might have been the view of 18th century philosophers. It's not the view of the Bible. Even the most cursory reading of the Bible reveals that the God of Israel is intimately involved in His creation, guiding it, directing it, providing for it, and especially His human creatures, whom He addresses, whom He cares about, whom He lures and cajoles and punishes and draws to Himself. God is personally and directly involved with His creation, especially with His human creation. Think here of Psalm 139, which is my favorite psalm. Lord, you search me and you know me. You know my resting and my rising. You discern my purpose from afar. Before ever a word's on my lips, Lord, you know it through and through. Behind and before you besiege me, your hand ever laid upon me. That magnificent psalm is not talking about a deist God who's distantly indifferent to the world. No, a God that knows me, as St. Augustine said, better than I know myself. He's closer to me than I am to myself. Well, see, I think Father Stu beautifully exhibits this understanding of God because it tells a story of this kind of unlikely hero. Stuart Long was a young man, a boxer, and kind of a bit of a roustabout, a guy that lived a fairly wild life. After his boxing career collapsed, he went to Hollywood, hoping to break into movies or TV like so many, thousands of other people every year. That didn't really work out. Felt a bit lost, where's his life going? And then one day he's working at a grocery store. He's at the meat counter. And he sees this lovely young woman. And he's pretty straightforward. He sees her and calls out to her and, expresses interest in her. She, kind of puts him off. In time, he figures out, she loves to hang out at this Catholic church. Now, the guy wasn't Catholic. He wasn't religious in any way. But he was interested in that girl, and so he went to the church, and he found her. And then he begins, he knows nothing about Catholicism, but he begins kind of courting her. And at one key point, she says, look, I would never consider dating someone who was not baptized. And so still not really interested in religion, much more in her, he says, okay, I'm game, I'll go through the RCIA program. And so he does, and he indeed becomes baptized. Now, here's what I find really interesting about this. The baptism led him, I think by its own sort of efficacious power, it led him into a deeper and deeper appreciation of the faith. He begins going to Mass, he begins praying, and he's led into the heart of the faith. But here's the thing, what brought him there? It was this girl. You say, oh, just a coincidence. She happened to be in the grocery store that day. Not for people who have faith, not for people who look at the world with the eyes of faith, but God, who's intimately interested in each one of us personally, luring us and drawing us, guiding us. By placing that young woman in the grocery store then, led him by steady steps to the parish, to the Mass, to baptism, and then we find out, eventually toward a consideration of the priesthood. What's God about? Leading us, guiding us, drawing us. There's an extraordinary moment. So it's after he's baptized. Stu goes through this dreadful motorcycle accident. It's brutally depicted in the film with great realism. As he's recovering from that, his sense of vocation really begins to grow upon him. And that leads to my second theme, this vocation, the call. I know in our culture, we hyper-valorize self-assertion. If you doubt me on this, watch practically any movie, listen to practically any song, read practically anyone's Facebook post. The moment of self-discovery and self-expression, I find my path, I find my way. That's what it's all about. When I break free from the constraints of my family, my society, my religion, and I find my own path. See, but the Bible could care less about that. I've called it the ego drama, right? The drama that I'm producing and writing and starring in. The Bible doesn't care about that. What the Bible's interested in is the moment when we discover what God is calling us to do, what God is calling us to be. When we listen, finally, to a higher voice, not the voices of those around us, not the strident voices of the culture, not our own little voice, but rather to the voice of God. In that moment, we discover truly who we are. That's the moment of joyful liberation from all these other attachments and so on. Okay, that's the biblical view as opposed to the cultural view today. I think Father Stu beautifully portrays this as well. So the providential God, putting certain people and things in his path, led him by steady steps into the church and eventually to the call to the priesthood. And it's kind of a funny series of moments in the movie when this very unlikely character, so think of a tough-talking, somewhat foul-mouthed boxer, a very worldly guy looking for fame and money and so on, but now begins to say to his friends and family, I want to be a priest. When he tells his mother, it's a lovely moment in the movie, she says, you mean for Halloween? No, I want to be a priest. Well, predictably, he faces down lots of challenges from his family and from his friends, and eventually even when he comes to the seminary, from the seminary administrators, because they see him as a very unlikely candidate. Well, that's also very biblical, isn't it? Very often, indeed typically, when someone's called by God, they've got to face down a lot of opposition because it runs counter to the intuitions of the culture. I mean, both ancient and modern. Find your own path. Do what everyone else is doing. When you follow God's call, you're bound to face opposition, as Father Stu does. There's, of course, the climax of the movie in many ways is after he joins the seminary, he's really about to be ordained. He discovers that he has this terrible disease, something like Lou Gehrig's disease, a degenerative muscle disease, that's going to lead just to his death. And then we see this once really vibrant, tough, very fit boxer becoming a pretty decrepit old man before his time. There's the ultimate challenge in some ways to his vocation. There's a wonderful scene where he's praying alone in the chapel and just crying out his anguish to God. Well, that's another obstacle, if you want, to vocation. But by that time, it's so deep in him, and he knows this is the path that he has to follow. And he beautifully discovers then that it's precisely through his suffering that his vocation reaches fulfillment, because now Father Stu becomes a vehicle of grace to armies of people who come to him in a way they won't come to other priests because they know this is a man who suffered. This is a man who's lived through a lot, and so they come to him for counseling and for confession. His vocation flourished precisely through his suffering. His fidelity to the call is what mattered. See, here's the thing, everybody. I wonder how many of us, even believers, realize that the most important work we're going to do in life is discerning God's call. It's not finding worldly success. I mean, that's fine as far as it goes. But that's not the most important work we're going to do. It's not getting into the best school. It's not getting the best job. I mean, those are fine. But the most important work we're going to do is the work of discerning our vocation. How the providential God is calling us to follow him. That's what it's about. Well, I think if you're interested in these themes, and every biblical person should be, you could do a lot worse than watch this film, Father Stu, which is a very dramatic and I think satisfying presentation of these great motifs of providence and vocation. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.